everybody. We have with us today Bert Popping. Hello, Bert. How are you?
Very well, Cesare. I'm very pleased. I'm honored to be invited to the interview.
It's our pleasure. And tell you a bit more about you and the company you represent, Focus. Where are you based? What's your business?
Well, Focus is the first letters of food consulting strategically. So we're a food consulting company. We've been in the business for about 25 years, always around food safety, new technologies, testing, analytical procedures, analytical strategies. So we work with different types of client. We work with stakeholders from the food industry, where we, for example, advise on strategic testing strategy, but also on strategic food safety strategies. We work with technology developers, where we help them identify markets for the technology that could be laboratories, but that also, and especially lately, could be technologies that can be applied in a food factory setting. So we're moving away a little bit from the traditional laboratory setting for food testing to a more rapid and often more cost-efficient on-site testing at the food manufacturer site. And to answer your other question, we're based in Germany, close to Frankfurt. So we're about 35 minutes from the airport in wonderful Bavaria.
Oh, great. Thank you for the introduction. 25 years, it's a lot of experience.
Thank you.
So your focus is on real-time solutions in the production facilities. It's what you are meaning, speaking of these devices. Elaborate a bit more, because this is interesting for our followers.
But certainly. I think I need to put that in the context of the EU Horizon calls that have taken place recently. The European Commission, European Union, has called for innovative projects that look at, for one, the traceability of product throughout the supply chain, but also for testing technologies that are not only laboratory-based, but also on-site. And here, the European Commission recently funded one of the projects where we're a partner in, that looks at exactly those aspects. So artificial intelligence-based traceability of products on the one hand, and on-site in-factory testing on the other hand. At the end of the 4 years, hopefully we have an AI-based traceability system that outperforms existing systems, and some more devices that can be used by factory staff. And that's quite important. So you don't have to have a PhD on site to operate a device. Those are simple devices that factory workers can use, and they get a result that tells them, yes, use it, or no, don't.
Okay, great. Well, we are used to multidisciplinary projects, so I guess that your 25 years on the field were the better school that you might have to gain knowledge in this field. But what's your background? Because, you know, you're speaking of AI and food analytics. Where you come from? Where do you come from?
Well, by training, I'm a biologist. Molecular biology and immunology. So I know a lot about antibodies, testing using ELISA, PCR. But throughout my career, I've also looked after the food chemistry division. So I've learned how to operate liquid chromatography devices, so the food chemistry analytical techniques that includes testing for contaminants, testing for residues, or food processing contaminants that basically are generated during the processing of food through high heat in combination with certain chemicals. So the area where, you know, I'm not so familiar with is more the microbiological side, but food chemistry and molecular biology, so allergens, food fraud testing in particular, is one of the areas of our expertise.
Okay. Very interesting, because I'm a lawyer, but I try to not do the lawyer as much. So I completely understand your your interest for those hybrid projects. And and recently I recorded some videos, probably doing damages about some economic aspect of the food chain, about the impact of war and Ukraine on our supply chains. And since we were discussing before about this, what's your take now on the current situation? Because when you look at the current food price development, this is quite worrying, because we see a clear spike due to COVID, to the supply chain disruption, to the war, and so on and so forth. But I notice other very worrying indicators looking around. For instance, the Sole 24 Ore, one of our main newspaper, speaking of economy, is pointing out from few weeks that there is a gap, a spread between the inflation and the increase in price of food and other staple goods, and the increase in cost of production that is incredible, because today the companies are raising the prices, in most cases in a measure that is inferior to the inflation, but the average index that measured the increase in production costs says that we have an average increase of 40%. So when this gap will be filled, how we fill this spread without, making the price exploding, it's a big question mark to me, and it's worrying.
Yeah, I think right now we have three factors. One is the increase in energy costs that basically spreads across the field. So we have increase in production cost, increase in transport cost. So that drives some of the price hikes that we've seen. And I think most of us notice when we refuel our car that, we don't get it for the same price that we did, 2 years ago. But the other factors are simply shortages on the market for certain products that are baseline products, that are commodities, that especially those two countries which are at war produce and export in substantial volumes. So if you look, for example, at the wheat, the major producer are China and India. China produces about 130 million tons of wheat. India somewhere around 95 million. But the quantities that they export are literally negligible. The big exporting countries are Ukraine, US, Canada, France, Germany. And because two of the parties, Ukraine and Russia, are at war, and the export of grains is not taking place, we're basically having a gap of round about 30%, because the two countries, Russia and Ukraine, together make approximately 30% of the wheat market. And when you look at the sunflower oil market, it's even worse, because the two largest producers are Ukraine and Russia, and the largest exporters are Ukraine and Russia, so making 55% of the total market. It's going to be very difficult to basically replace those vegetable oil, and whatever they will be replaced with, there will be a shortage of the oils that they are replaced with. So we will have, for some years to come, a shortage of these commodities. That will have an impact on prices, but it also will have an impact on food fraud, or the potential of food fraud.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that in Italy now, due to this increased price in energy and gas and all the rest, when I have to refill my car, that is quite big, I have to go to the gas station and pay in two different tranches, because if you put your card into the gas station machine, you're authorized just to do 100 euro of gas. So it's not anymore for a car of 60, 70 liters,
Right.
You have this, yeah, but I guess we have more scary, pitfalls from this situation, because I read about the fact that most of the wheat, especially, coming from those countries is destined to North Africa or other countries that might have problems of food security, not like in Europe, where of course, poverty might be a problem in certain areas in certain segments of the population, but is not still luckily a matter of food security.
That is certainly correct. I mean, we've seen the FAO, they published a food security report about 2-3 weeks ago. That was based on the figures from 2021, where we were faced with COVID. And there some supply chains were already stressed. And the outcome, their estimate of how many additional people were threatened by famine was 150 million. So 150 million on top what we already have. So now if we're looking at the big grain exporters, Ukraine and Russia, that will not export or maybe export a smaller portion to the countries in need, especially as you correctly mentioned, Sheila, the North African countries, but also Bangladesh, Indonesia, and so on, that will cause additional millions, presumably, that we'll see in the next report coming up that are faced with hunger, and there is no immediate solution. We might be able to, at the midterm, to repurpose some of the agricultural land that we have, but it's not going to remedy the issue. So now there are some researchers looking at some of the novel technologies, gene editing or genome editing that is used synonymously, is the new techniques that is on the market or has been on the market for a number of years, where people have performed some research. And this is how they attempt to close some of the gaps that we have in the wheat production, and maybe also in the sunflower production.
Yeah, also because another factor is in increasing costs is the cost of fertilizers. That is spiking again. We have shortages. I read that the European Union just did an agreement with China to avoid further disruption, because China, I guess, it's the first world producer of fertilizers. So yeah, when we speak of agriculture, we have this factor that plays a role. But yeah, and where do you precisely see a role for these new genome editing techniques? They use less fertilizers. They have more yields. How can you elaborate a bit more? Maybe also the differences between the old GMOs, techniques, and the new ones. Just
Yeah. Allow me to start with the old GMOs. They got a really bad reputation. That was driven, in my view, so this is my personal take on this, by two factors. One, the lack of transparency of the biotechnology industry in communicating what the risk, what the benefit of those technologies are. And then certainly some of the activities of the NGOs that were more or less scientifically based, that created an atmosphere of fear about GMO, genetically modified organisms, similar to the fear that was created around certain chemicals. We call that chemophobia, and we see that across the board. Now, that was particularly strong for the GMO, and back in the 1994, 95, we saw Greenpeace standing in front of major UK supermarket chains and campaigning for people to not buy products containing GMOs. So these products, other than in the animal feed side, have never really made it to the market here in Europe. It's a different story in the US. They're more accustomed to the old style GMOs. Now, what's interesting is that the gene edited or genome edited plants seem to be a lesser concern for the citizen. There was an interesting study that was done. There are very few studies right now because it's a new topic. But the study that was done, they looked at consumers from Australia, mainly the Commonwealth, but also Belgium and France. And what they found is that when they compared the old style GMOs to the genetically engineered new products, that more consumers are amenable to actually buying them and consuming them. And that is mainly driven by the perception that the gene-edited products are safer than the GMOs. Is that justified will need to be seen, but certainly the fact is that most of them have just point mutation where certain amino acids are changed that lead to, for example, and we talked about that, you said yield. Yield is one of them, but there are also varieties where we're looking at drought resistance. There are varieties being researched and produced that are looking at an increase of vitamin D. So, for example, a tomato from the UK, John Innes Center, is looking at that, and they passed the bill for kind of a deregulation of gene-edited crops to the parliament. So we're likely seeing that passed in the UK. That means that unless you have a specific type of gene-edited products, you won't have to go through an approval procedure. And the only exception that they have, and I think we're seeing that in other countries too, is that when you have so-called PIPs. So PIPs is plant incorporated pesticides. That means if you have, for example, a gene inserted in those plants that is toxic for certain insects. So the corn borer in maize was a big threat to farmers. So one of the biotechnology companies developed a genetically modified maize that expressed a protein, the CRY1A protein, that is toxic for the corn borer when the corn borer feeds on it, but not toxic for humans because it's more in the leaves than in the corn. And if you have with your gene-edited crops those PIPs incorporated, so if you have a product that is a pesticide, then it would still go through approval. But unless it's just a minor change, yield, vitamin D increase, it probably won't have to go through the normal approval procedure. Of course, that comes with an enormous impact in one, development time, and two, cost. So if you look at the old style GMOs, the traditional, they reckon that there was a report out 3 weeks ago. They looked at cost of developing GMOs. One was looking at the old and the new gene-edited crops. So the old crops, the GMO crops, they cost around 100 million per development until you have them on the market through approval. It takes about 16 years. Now, the gene editing is much simpler. It costs a lot less. 10 million, it's the estimate right now, and 5 million. So those products would be on the market much quicker. And how simple those gene editing is can actually be seen if you visit a site in the US. It's called the Odin, because that company sells gene editing kits for home use. They're not allowed in Europe, so I do not advise buying them if you live in Europe. But if you happen to live in the US and listening to this, you may want to visit the site and you can do your gene editing at home.
Oh, great. I'll try to do my little experiment in gene editing of some tomatoes or interesting. But yeah, no, this was a very thorough representation of the situation. I have several points in this. First, I think that how you frame the conversation is very important, because in Italy, we are seeing that also the more traditional farmers' organization that usually are very conservative are now quite start to change their mind about technology in agriculture. And probably it's because from the beginning, we start to speak about the benefits of those technologies. We never spoke of those technologies in a very scary way. And this is a factor. The second one, I think it's more painful, is the fact that we suffer several episodes like the Xylella crisis for olive trees, or now the severe drought that we have in the north of Italy that is affecting terribly the rice cultivation, that are telling us that that's the way. because the rice drought resistant species edited with these new techniques is one of the examples that I see the Commission is using on its website when they speak of these new gene editing techniques. And yet, from a regulatory perspective, what's the situation now? Because many years ago, it was 2017, 18, the Court of Justice said that basically new genome editing techniques are the same as the old GMOs. It was criticized heavily by the scientific community, and with all the reasons, I have to say, because the technology is absolutely different, and I can understand as a lawyer that is different. But now the landscape is changing. Do you want to, explain a bit what's going on? Yeah.
Now, I think I'm carrying out to Athens here, telling the changing landscape to a lawyer who is very well aware of the changing landscape, but for the benefit of the audience, I'm very happy to do that. Yeah. So the interesting thing is that when you look at especially the Commonwealth countries, the old Commonwealth countries, New Zealand, Australia, you have Canada, you have US, and now also most recently UK, they all deregulated gene editing products, except for the PIPs that we spoke beforehand. They have to still go through the normal approval process. Here in Europe, there was the two regulations, the 1829 and 1830 from 2011, that basically regulate the approval of GMO crops. The European Commission has recently requested a study on the appropriateness of those regulations to basically apply to gene edited products. The bottom line was that the current regulations are not fit for purpose. So my interpretation of that is that we will also see a deregulation in due course. Maybe in Europe it takes a little longer than in other countries, but we will certainly see a deregulation of those products here too.
Yeah, it's clear that the Commission adopted this strategy to say the old regulation is not fit for purpose, to change a bit their route, maybe on the pressure of other countries that were deregulating. We will see something, but we don't know exactly what we will see in future, if they will design a new regulatory approval path. To me, at the moment, even as a lawyer, is not clear. But coming back to regulatory approval, you mentioned the cost of developing those products. Many companies, many people complain about the costs, but the cost to me is not really a barrier, because it doesn't matter if you are a multinational company or if you are a startup, you need a lot of capital to invest in those technologies. So it's not the cost, the problem. The problem is timing. Usually we have very lengthy processes in Europe when it comes to pre-market approval, and this is something that has to be considered by the Commission if we don't want to lose billions and billions of investments again. As a system, I would say, I dare to say, because this is exactly what happened 20 years ago with GMOs.
I think the other challenge that we're seeing is now that it seems that the climate change is accelerating, and we certainly need to adapt or have products that are adapted to a changing climate. If we do that the old way, the GMO way, waiting 16 years, the climate might have already changed to a direction that we cannot anticipate. Now, 5 years is much more appealing time frame to actually adapt to the changing climate and basically have products on the market that may be able to grow in regions that are more arid. Maybe, Italy in the future will also be a little bit drier. The heat waves that we're seeing in Spain now, similar situation, all the reservoirs are dry. But I think it's important that we have those tools to allow us to adapt agricultural techniques to the current situation.
I read that we are cultivating coffee now in Sicily, so clock is ticking, I guess. We don't. Climate change is here, and so how is the outlook for those new products, in your opinion, we will, I guess we can see them on the market in future. We have hope. Yeah.
I think, especially since the time to market is much shorter, people or biotech companies are much more inclined to invest in those developments. And the fact that, you know, certain region we have vitamin deficiencies, they can easily be basically eased out with those new products. So we're very likely to see a range of new products that where consumers may not even notice a significant change. If it's yield or if it's the ability to grow in drier climates, then you would not notice as a consumer. There's no change to flavor, there's no change to texture, there's no change to taste. But for the farmer, it will make a substantial difference. So one of the very interesting paper that I read that came out this week was a paper in Nature Food, and that was coming from researchers in the UK, in Harpen, from the plant physiology department there. They actually estimate that with minor changes of the genome using the gene editing technique, they can essentially double the yield of wheat. So that would certainly alleviate some of the major concerns, the major shortages that we have right now in the world, and it could contribute to alleviating hunger in especially those countries that are particularly in need of wheat supplies.
Yeah, that's important. There is this discussion about the fact if we are a growing population or we are going towards extinction, you know, like Elon Musk is saying, well, we're just aging, we are not increasing the population. And that's true for certain countries like Italy, but it doesn't matter. I would say if the average age is 60 or 80 or 40, we all have to eat. So
that's right.
we will have billions of people to feed. And and the amount of land is remaining stable.
Yeah, it's limited. Yeah,
definitely is limited. Okay, well, that changing a bit the topic, since I think everybody knows we work on that a lot, also together in the past. Do you see any impact on food frauds coming from these spikes in price, from these shortages? Because everybody's speaking about food fraud, but you know, I'm not sure that that all the companies, the stakeholders knows where to look at or what to look at to really spot food frauds. Okay, it's clearly a threat, but is real, is there.
Well, I don't know if you take the fact that we have already seen some products, if that was mere coincidence or already a consequence of certain shortages, that were contaminated or adulterated from especially Asian countries this year, may be an indicator of what is going to come. So here in Germany, we had a number of cases where certain oils were contaminated with peanut oil. So peanut is, you know, if it's a raw vegetable oil, it still has the proteins that can trigger allergic reaction. It's refined, maybe less so, but still there was a concern that the peanut contaminated oil or peanut oil contaminated other vegetable oil is a consequence of the shortages of the sunflower oil, which are widely used in the food industry. And if you look at the if you look back at the milk scandal that we had in Asia as well, the melamine scandal, if you remember that the adulterant that was used was a small molecule, the melamine, that is nitrogen rich. Now here in this situation, we're also seeing a deficit of proteins. Here the proteins are not coming from milk, they're coming from wheat. But basically, you can use the same molecule to also adulterate the wheat flour. So in principle, there is a chance that we will see melamine contamination coming up again with the shortages of wheat. So people will try to make more money on adding melamine to it to increase what they call the apparent protein content, because also wheat is traded by or valued by protein content. And for the sunflower oil, of course, we will have replacement oils. There's canola, there is maybe to a lesser extent olive oil, but here certainly we're likely to see some of the qualities deteriorating. So you may have lampant oil that is unfit for human consumption, contaminated in a bottle of oil that is on the supermarket shelf. So those are the typical things to watch out for. And of course, not factoring in the energy crisis, which makes also the production of other food products more expensive, which gives basically an incentive for fraudsters across the field of food production. Because if you can cut corners and get a product or an ingredient cheaper to your client without being found out that it has been adulterated, you're going to save a lot of money. So I think the opportunities are certainly there. And it's also indicative that, for example, the Irish Food Safety Agency, they have put, during COVID already, they have put in place a specific committee that looked at the impact of food fraud or the potential of food fraud on the Irish food market. I've not seen similar committees set up in other countries, but it's certainly something that makes the Irish appear to be ahead of the game. And I think once we see more food fraud coming through in Europe, there might be an establishment of such committees as well. Having said that, I think our control authorities in general are pretty good at picking up trends and picking up indicators that would hint at food fraud being committed. Also, the AAC system that they have in place is helpful there. But of course, fraudsters are very innovative and usually more innovative than the authorities. So we're likely to see some more.
Yeah, but you gave some great suggestion. If nobody's doing that kind of fraud on wheat from tomorrow, they surely will, Bert.
I think fraud these days is not is what we call a white collar crime. So basically, it's a scientist crime. It's people that are educated. They know how to tweak things, and melamine is just the obvious choice.
Yeah, and from a lawyer's perspective, here you have the incentives, you have the opportunity, also because Irish are ahead of the game all the time on food fraud. But honestly, from COVID, the official controls in many countries are a bit stressed by other tasks, and they have been obliged to reduce a bit the audits or the controls, especially on the field. They move certain activities in virtual mode and so on. So yeah, you have the opportunity, and you have, of course, the interested agents in doing something, let's say, a bit borderline. And especially wheat is traded, traders are, might be tempted. And another question, maybe the last for today, then we can speak a bit more about, other things. But is there anything that manufacturers can do to prevent those frauds besides, try to stay informed? Because we saw a lot of strange things in the recent years, ethylene oxide, soy lecithin with peanuts again, the mustard in wheat in Italy, all big contamination, in some cases probably not voluntary, not coming from frauds, but something that was quite strange to see popping up at that scale without anybody noticing that there was a problem.
Yeah. I think nowadays, I already mentioned the project that was funded by the European Commission that will develop new tools, but there are actually already a number of tools on the market that basically allow the screen of incoming raw materials using very simple technology. It needs a little bit of setup, but it ultimately allows what we call a smart sampling. So imagine you have like 100 bags coming in, and you sample from 5 of those bags. You have a 1 in 20 chance to find the bag in the 100 bags that contains the contamination. So your risk of missing that is fairly high. Now, some of those devices, many of those devices actually are what we call point and shoot. So you just hold it into the bag, push a button, you get a result immediately. So it takes you about maybe 5 minutes to screen the 100 bags, and you know exactly if one profile is matching, it will raise an alarm, and then you can sample that bag and send it to the laboratory. So this is something that I see food manufacturer can already do now. And we have a lot of experience with those companies providing the tools, but also with the deployment of these tools, what the framework. So if anybody needs some help there, we're certainly happy to advise on what the best product might be. I think this is a trend, and this is in line with a project that the European Commission funded. We're certainly seeing the first line of analytical defense shifting from the food testing laboratory to the food manufacturer side, even if they may not have a food testing lab on site. They don't need it anymore because most of the screening tools are handheld devices where you don't need a laboratory setup for. So it will become much easier in the future.
Yeah. So a shift to a more preventive approach whenever it's possible. And that's reasonable because, you know, I heard often companies complying that, oh, we receive raw material, we noticed that was adulterated, but we waited like 6 days or 10 days, the analysis from the lab.
True.
You could argue that if they accept the ingredient and they manufacture the ingredient immediately without waiting the certificate, they might have some responsibility. But you know, the supply chain, the timing that is required to stay on the market is not compatible sometimes with the time of long analytical procedures. So
I think these devices will really benefit manufacturers in two ways. One, it reduces the storage time because, as you correctly said, time to result when you send to the laboratory, depending on which service you ask for, is either more expensive or it takes a few more days. Then you cannot do anything with the product until you have the result back. But here you basically have a screening procedure that takes you a couple of seconds. Then you can decide, okay, I've done my due diligence, I can put them into production, or no, there was something that was out of spec, out of specification, and you put it on hold, send the sample to a lab, and the lab can then confirm is that something to be concerned about. I think it works time-wise, it also works cost-wise, because basically screening those will only cost a couple of cents rather than hundreds of euros. So there are benefits. There are some limitations to that, of course. None of the devices can test for everything, but neither can the laboratory, because you always instruct the laboratory test for melamine, and then they will test for melamine. They will not maybe test for urea or other nitrogen compounds. So it always comes in limitation, but certainly these mobile technologies, on-site technologies will bring also food manufacture a big step forwards towards food safety. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, and we are speaking of screening devices mostly. So each analytical method might have some issues, some uncertainties, or it's known to everybody now after the pandemic. So we might live with that. It doesn't. It's the same. Also, if you do an analysis in an accredited lab after, you still have certain question marks sometimes about it's enough sensible, this method to detect what I'm looking for is, anyway. Great. Any other exciting project that you are following or that you will start, that you are up to, what you are projecting for the rest of the year?
One of the ones, since you mentioned Xylella, so one of the other projects that we're involved in that's very exciting is the olive growing project. It's called Gen for Olive. That is actually a Mediterranean country project where we're looking at identifying old varieties that may carry resistant genes. So basically breeding technologies that may help fight against Xylella, against certain droughts, shorter cold periods, And that is quite exciting, and we're very lucky to be involved in that project. Another one to drive food safety, but also yield and variety in olives, and they are one of my favorite foods.
Yeah, that's great. Recently, beside my ordinary stuff, I'm just failing on TikTok, doing my little experiments about communication. This sounds more like a project from a reliable guy, not like. Great. Yeah. Thank you, Bert. It was really interesting. I will leave your contacts in the video for all the audience. And if you want to do any final remark, well, I'll leave you the floor.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. And maybe we can speak another time with some more developments about those projects.
Certainly.
So, thank you. Thank you, Bert. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.